And it's interesting, AJ raises the point of maybe a kid with autism would end up dropping out of school and going to work on a farm. I wonder what happens now to adults with autism. You get a lot of services when you're in school, but there comes a day when you kind of age out of that. What happens to these people, Lauren?
I think that's such an important question. And the data to date has been very discouraging. And I hesitate to say this in front of parents even because I think it's changing all the time as we have newer and better interventions. But, for instance, a study in 2009 showed that less than a quarter of kids with autism, of young adults with autism, and average or better intelligence, so bright people, were able to function independently. The vast majority of kids were dependent on their parents and the like. And I think that AJ's point is important. As society changes, what that means can look different. When we move away from a farm, say, to an urban setting, we do see a subset of bright people in their basements playing computer games and, dependent on their parents. And I think that comes back to a point that Jennifer was making earlier, as was Amy, about it's very hard if you have autism to work within what they call the neurotypical world, to work and so one of the things that we do at Children's is we're developing interventions for the higher functioning kids, and it's a combination of teaching these guys both skills that they need to be more neurotypical in certain settings, to be more flexible, to get social cues, but also advocacy for them to learn. And there's a big group of folks with autism who help a lot with this by writing wonderful books. Like John Elder Robison has written a book called Be Different, which is the book to read if you've got Asperger's as a young adult and you're trying to navigate the world. But to also know when they can advocate for themselves and say, you know what, I need a break right now. Or, you know what, I don't need to have a job where I have to interact with 12 different people every day like you do here on this show. And so it's that balance of learning some new skills and learning to advocate for themselves that we really hope will change those discouraging statistics about how people function, in adulthood.
Jennifer, it must be such an yes, Amy, please go ahead.
Sorry, just because this is something that I've been writing about recently, and this sort of this generation of young adults now who have been diagnosed at higher rates, sort of starting in the early 90s is when the rate started really climbing, and it was because of this, partly because of this expansion in the criteria, and so now they're reaching the end of high school, and arguably, they're better prepared than any generation that has come before because there have been fights to include them in mainstream classrooms. They've gotten earlier interventions, and this question is sort of, and they're guaranteed, federal services through the IDEA, the Education Act for People with Disabilities, through high school. But so what happens after high school to them? And, one young man that I wrote about, his name was Justin Kanya, who loved animation and is a great artist, and it was sort of about, what would become of him after high school. And one thing that I hope more high schools do is to have this a program that really tried to get this young man, Justin, a job before he left high school. Because sort of once you leave high school, it's sort of, there's no guarantee of services, and often the job matching, it's hard to find a job for these kids. And he found a job. He didn't find a job at Disney, which would have been his ideal job as someone who's obsessed with animation. But he found a job at a local bakery, decorating cakes. And so it's sort of this effort that will have to, I think, take place starting in school to integrate young adults with autism into their communities in a better way than they have been in the past.
Jennifer, this must be an issue that is really an anguish question for a lot of parents.
Yeah, I try to take things one day at a time, because when I get too far ahead of myself, I start to get really wound up. But I can't deny that I think about this a lot. And I think so much of it, in addition to giving these kids the tools that they need to succeed and to maximize their strengths, because my gosh, my son in particular and so many other kids on the spectrum have these amazing strengths. I think so much of it is about increasing awareness and acceptance among society so that people who are hiring become more aware that a child or a young adult who may not give the greatest interview, but if you want them to be a computer programmer or something along those lines, they might be light years ahead of anybody else you could possibly interview. So I think it's the coupling of the services for the families and the young adults, but it's also increasing awareness and acceptance among our society that everybody's different and everyone has something different and unique to offer.
And Dr. Insel.
I think we've kind of edged up to what is maybe the most important issue related to these prevalence numbers, because if you start to do the math, it looks like out of the 70 million children in this country, if 1 in 88 is affected, 10 years from now we're going to be looking at a very powerful social challenge, which is how do we provide not only the employment and housing, but other kinds of supports that these kids are going to need as they become adults with autism. And I don't think we have fully embraced that. So this is going to be an issue beyond the acute prevalence that everybody's looking at when people are saying, what does this mean? What's driving it? That we need to be thinking much more carefully and much more aggressively about what the services are going to look like in 2022.
So these would be services like group homes, or what kinds of things are you thinking about?
Well, you've heard about some already. As Amy mentioned, the importance of providing employment opportunities. Mm-hmm. We call that supported employment. At that end of the spectrum, where kids are able to begin to work and to become very involved in the things that they may be most passionate about, we have lots of hope, and we should be particularly positive. But remember, this is a spectrum, and you're going to have some children who at age 18 are still not toilet trained and still don't have language and are still functioning at a very, very primitive level. What happens for that population, and how far can we go?
Lauren.
And one thing that I like to emphasize is that under the federal special education laws, IDEA, public schools are required to develop transition plans, and it's something that I think that we want to push harder and harder on for the full range of kids, the kids who are going to need support, but also for the more than half of the sort of autism group as a whole that really needs that understanding and maybe a few tricks of the trade. And I would just offer one example of a child that I had worked with who was a brilliant mathematician, and she actually went to NASA on an internship and was about to fail out of the internship because when she got there, she'd turn on the computer and go straight to the games that she liked to play. And with one simple intervention of removing her access to those games and having her login pop up on what she had to do, she actually solved the problem for NASA in the summer internship and was hired for a job. So sometimes it's about little things that have to do with parents and clinical teams and teachers helping employment understand what a person needs to be successful.
And I think, if I can just jump in, I think we've made this point, but it's worth sort of stating directly that many individuals with autism have great talents and sort of talents that may be the result of the same thing that is causing their disabilities, but sort of this intense attention to detail and enjoyment of repetitive activities, and sometimes just seeing the world in a very different way from the way that normal more conventionally brained people see it. So that the idea that they could be employed is not crazy, but in fact they could provide some great benefit to society if we were able to better absorb them into the workplace.